there is a right to resist under international law, right? So this thing that is very special about Palestine is that it is officially recognized as an occupied territory. It is officially recognized as under occupation. And for all of its flaws, international law actually is not entirely completely co-opted by only Western interest. I mean, over the last 80 years, developing nations have been very, very good at inserting certain provisions, especially in human rights law. And, you know, people who are cynical about human rights law will say, oh, human rights is just a talking point for the West to do whatever they want, which is true on the one hand. On the other hand, the human rights system that we have is not completely controlled and under Western power. And it does render certain positive outcomes. One of them is that there is enshrined actually a right to resist, which is quite special because international law, especially the one after the Second World War that developed, usually outlaws any kind of military action by groups. There used to be the right to go to war of states. It used to be a sovereign right before the Second World War, and then for the First World War, and then it was swept away. That is gone. Now states still go to war, but it is quite special that the current system recognizes the right of armed resistance. Now Israel keeps saying that any and all kind of armed resistance, even people just thinking about it, that's terrorism. And we will literally dress up as doctors, go into hospitals and shoot anyone. As they did the other day, which is the grotesquest kind of like human rights violation there is, because these people are not only under protection from human rights law, they are under protection of humanitarian law too. It is illegal to shoot people who are already unable to fight because they're, I mean, okay, apart all of that. What kind of just can you explain to me the difference between the right to resist and where is resistance and where is terrorism, like legally speaking? What kind of right do the Palestinians have to resist with armed force?
Well, the whole issue, first of all, I mean, the whole issue of the right to resist with armed forces, actually, it's one of these things that international lawyers debate about. I agree with you. I think there is an international right to resist with armed force. And, you know, I would be happy to sort of argue that with anybody, but it's something which still sort of remains a point of contention. But there is definitely a right to resist in other forms, for sure. And one thing that is definite is that the colonial power, basically, no other country should, or no other country has the right to suppress or oppress the expressions of the right to self-determination through violence. So what Israel is doing, I mean, this is one of those, and of course you're very familiar with this, this is one of those sort of weird sort of gray zones that we have in international law, where you know, whether or not there is the right to use armed force remains a topic of debate for a lot of people, but there is definitely no right on the other party to suppress actions towards the right of self-determination. So there's a little bit of this kind of vague area here, this vague gray zone. But you know, when it comes to humanitarian law, of course, it's quite clear. You know, we have certain things that are war crimes and certain things that, you know, that are within the legitimate spectrum of the conduct of war. And this is actually one of the strongest arguments, of course, that people do have a right to resist. There is a right to resist using armed force. When we look at additional protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions, that makes it very, very clear that people fighting against apartheid regimes or racist oppression, they are they should be recognized as legitimate combatants. So that one would argue by extension, says that is basically dictating that those kind of armed struggles are legitimate international armed conflicts, and thereby they are legitimate, right? So that's the thing. When we talk about terrorism, of course, as we all know, I mean, there's no international definition of terrorism, and there never could be. Because, you know, countries like the United States and Israel would say, oh, yeah, definition of terrorism, and anybody who points a gun towards us is a terrorist and we can blow them out of existence. Whereas you have, you know, a lot of other countries that have been the subject of Western colonialism and imperialism and brutal oppression for many, many, decades, if not centuries. And of course, they see the Palestinian struggle as a legitimate national independence movement, and a lot of other struggles as well. So, they would never agree to those kind of, broad, overly broad, ridiculous definitions of terrorism. So that's why, we don't have it. We don't have a definition of terrorism. There are these kind of working definitions, and then you cite some of the influential governments and all this kind of thing. But there is no sort of one international single definition of terrorism. And, there never, I don't know, there never could be. I don't know that there ever could be. But, I think the thing is, when we talk about armed resistance, like, for example, if we are talking about, well, I don't really want to go down this road because there's a lot we don't know. But when we're talking about the attacks by Hamas and some of the other groups on 7th of October, it seems that there were violations of international humanitarian law. It seems that there were targeting of civilians. It is clear that there were also sort of hostage taking of civilians, and that is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. So yes, those are war crimes, and those need to be investigated, and people responsible should be brought to justice. That's quite clear. Now, at the same time, though, one of the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law is also, just because the other side did something wrong doesn't give you the right to break the rules. And so, clearly what Israel is doing is utterly, absolutely disproportionate, and it doesn't fall under any kind of sane definition of proportionality. So, what they're doing is, of course, is genocidal and litany of war crimes and crimes against humanity. That's very clear. But looking at the whole thing through humanitarian law is important, but it also has its pitfalls. And this is, when we get back to what I was talking about just now about international law being, it's very deferential towards governments, and it's the governments who create international law, as we all know, and it's, they create legal standards which they think they could live with, and in many cases, which they think will protect their interests. Mm-hmm. Like you rightly pointed out, once created, these kind of legal standards and mechanisms, they can have a life of their own, and they can, move in directions and bring about results which the governments had not foreseen and which aren't happy with.
Yeah,
and that's one of the good things.
Like when you push very, very hard back in 48 for a genocide convention because you just had a genocide done against you 3 years earlier, and you really want to prevent that, and
yes.
just so happens that you're going to be one of the next ones indicted under
look
it.
Look at what happens. Look at what happens. Yeah. That's just one of the examples. But of course, the whole thing about the humanitarian law is that it is very deferential towards the attacking party, and that's as that's one of the problems. It relies on what did the attacking party know at the time of the attack, or what could it have, what was the intelligence it had, and this kind of thing. And obviously we're never going to get to know that. But I was going over this kind of thing with my students throughout this term. I have a human rights class, and I teach about Palestine through the whole class. And it tended to be, up till now, it was generally sort of a little bit more of a focus on the West Bank and a little bit more of a focus on, ICCPR and ICSCR and those sort of bog standard international human rights treaties. But with what was going on in Gaza, it was just ridiculous. I had to just sort of throw out my entire plan and really focus on Gaza, really focus on IHL. And, as I was going over my students and with their final assignment, I was like, look, yes, we have this bit about what did the attacking state know at the time and all this kind of thing. But look, don't worry too much about this, because the damage that is caused, the casualties, the loss of civilian life, the civilian casualties, the damage to civilian objects are so blatant and so obvious, in this case, that in this case being, from all the Israeli attacks from 7th of October in general, it is just like, it's not even worth spending too much time going over it. You know, I mean, it's just like, what I'm saying is you can make a very clear and strong case for violations of IHL without dwelling into those minutiae, because it's so obvious and so blatant in this case. And that's what the South Africans did
Yeah. Yeah.
with such effectiveness. I mean, their brief is excellent. And yeah, so their brief is
And
excellent. Yeah.
And it's also the big threat. They keep threatening that with every violation you do and we get a hold of, we keep recording it and we will put
Oh
it
yeah.
into the record and we will keep collecting, a best of Israel that then will
Best
be
of
given
Israel,
to the
yes.
to the
Yes.
court in order to get to that conviction, right? But so this is another very good example of using a court not only just to litigate a case, but actually put political pressure in order to
Yeah. Yeah.
effect change, which is the most, if there's a way for the international judicial system have an impact on world politics, it's through that one, through this political route. And now I remember what I wanted to ask you before.
Yes.
I still am a believer in having international institutions because that's the best chance we have at
Yeah.
ever
Yeah.
getting to a
Yeah.
better place. So if we take the ICC as a negative case to study how a good idea can be ruined, utterly ruined, through institutionalizing the idea. Where did it go wrong? So the ICJ, in a certain sense, works because the 15 judges plus the ad hoc people are insulated from
Yeah.
politics to a good degree, and therefore they act independently. I mean, it is quite amazing that even the Israeli judge decided to judge
Yes.
like
Yes.
2 times with the others, which means the guy is insulated, right? He does not have to fear that he will be, I don't know, that something very bad will happen to him, and the other judges too. Also, the American
Mhm.
judge, like
Mhm.
very very surprising, like very
Yeah, it was a
objective.
pleasant surprise. Yes.
And ICC, obviously, there are other mechanisms at play that make sure that the prosecutor or whatever is under political control. Do you know what these mechanisms are? Where procedural issues went wrong in creating the court?
Well, I mean, the whole issue of international institutions and how they are subject to political pressure, this is a kind of, it's almost like the subject of another discussion, which we've gone for a
Mm-hmm.
long time. Um, uh, I, I don't really know what's going on in the mind of course, the current prosecutor and what sort of has been happening. I would be very surprised if, for example, when all of this started, he was getting these calls from the British Prime Minister who said, look, this is how we want to see things going. I would be kind of surprised if it were that blatant, but who knows? I mean, one of the mechanisms that states in general use on international institutions is the money. And
Mm.
this is a really serious issue, which I think has not received, the attention that it needs. Most UN agencies, and certainly the ones humanitarian ones, human rights, working in those kind of fields, are completely cash strapped. They have no money. And every time, they just barely have enough money from the regular budget, what we used to call the regular budget. These are like the assessed contributions, the sort of stable budget that the UN agency gets. But this doesn't go anywhere near, what is necessary, even for sort of like a normal functioning. And in particular, when there's a big emergency, what generally happens is that these agencies have to go around and ask governments for extra money. So these are called like voluntary contributions, and to deal with this emergency. This money and other kind of voluntary contributions that governments give even outside of times of emergencies. These are what we call them earmarked. So they are specified for certain purposes. Now, coming from Amnesty, I was sort of examining this kind of thing already when I was at Amnesty, and it was a very, very stark difference. With Amnesty International, of course, obviously we don't get donations from governments, we don't get donations from political parties, et cetera, et cetera. But the organization would never accept earmarked donations. Like you can never give how many thousands of dollars saying, I want this to be done for your work on China, for example. It was just not allowed. Like we would take the money, but we were like, yeah, we'll take your money, but How we use it is going to be up to us. And if you're unhappy with this, well, forget it.
Don't give us the money.
Yeah, don't give us the money. That's how it was. And it was a very principled position. And I feel that, that position is what has, to this day, made amnesty, kept amnesty's independence and insulated it from these kind of political pressures, which unfortunately a lot of other major international human rights organizations, NGOs too, they are subject to. And in the UN, it's a free-for-all. I mean, when the UN goes around to governments saying, could you please give us money to deal with this humanitarian operation? It's an emergency, it wasn't foreseen, and now we need money to deal with it. Well, obviously, we're not going to, the Bangladeshis and the Sierra Leones of the world. We're going to the big donor governments. We're going to the United States and Germany and Sweden and Japan. And, whatever other countries we feel might be interested in. And that's, that gives these countries a disproportionate say over how the money is spent. It's given for certain purposes, and there is quite often, said and unspoken and unspoken pressure on how they want to see it used. I've seen instances where it is, very sort of unspoken and subtle. I've seen instances where it was just, very blatant. And, through doing this kind of thing, they can control the international agenda and the functionings of these international organizations in a manner which is far, beyond the kind of sort of sinister direct control that one thinks. Now, with the ICC, there is, it didn't start off like that. At a certain point, they started receiving voluntary contributions for certain activities. And there was a lot of concern raised by international NGOs saying, like, this is not good. This is going down the wrong road. It hasn't gone to the point where, like, UNHCR or UNRWA is, I can't remember, I think it's like over 90% voluntary contributions, if I remember correctly. But it's, like these kind of other agencies, it's not got to that point. But the big difference between ICC and ICJ on this point is that ICC is operational. So ICC, it doesn't have, like offices, permanent offices all over the place, but it has investigators. And these investigators need to go places. They need to travel, and they need to do forensic investigations, and they need, people on the ground to do this, that, and the other. And this is a big deal. This is money. This is a lot of money. With the ICJ, you don't have this. The ICJ is just, these bunch of people sitting in The Hague, and they have their sort of, the people who work in the office, but they don't travel around and go to places and, actually do these kind of forensic investigations. That's not how they work. So that's one of the big differences. The more operational a UN agency is, the more it tends to rely on voluntary contributions, and the more vulnerable it gets to rich and powerful countries controlling the agenda. And this is one of the big, failings of the international system. It's one of the ways that the rich and powerful can maintain their claws into what goes on.
Saul, this was fascinating. I didn't know, and this is why we need experts who've worked on the ground in order to explain these issues. We could go on for another hour, I believe, but for now, we leave it at this one, and we'll talk again. Thank you very much for your insights.
Thanks very much, Pascal. Thanks.